Previously, in episode 7 of the home renovation series, I completed a master bedroom makeover and took the master bedroom from this to this. Now here we are in episode 8, the laundry makeover. In this episode, I am going to be taking the laundry and creating a stylish and functional space. You'll be surprised by what can be achieved with a basic laundry and how you can create a space where you actually don't mind spending your time.
This is the laundry space, and it's the last space inside the home that is going to be getting a makeover. This is going to have a complete makeover because there's not really much in here that we can keep original, and it really just does need a complete freshen up. The laundry trough is in a pretty bad way, so we're going to rip out this laundry trough. We're then going to replace this with a new laundry trough and add a laminate bench top that goes across here to this wall where you can sit your washing machine under that, but you've got a little bit of bench space to work within your laundry. We're then going to rip out these tiles and add new tiles up this wall, and this is probably going to be a beautiful feature tile, and the tile may be the tile that I use in that front entry to try and match that in nicely with the home. I'm then going to create a feature on this wall as well, add some shelving to that and make it look beautiful, because the idea is that we want to have a nice, fresh, filling laundry space. It's at the end of the hallway and it will draw a little bit of attention to it. Also, so that we have a nice space where people don't mind being here to do their laundry. This is the laundry cupboard, and so it's just going to all get painted inside this cupboard. That all has a whole lot of rubbish in there that's just going to need to come out. We're just going to paint all of that and then probably add some wood trim on the front of the shelves, similar to what I did in my pantry at home.
The first thing that I did was to remove the old laundry trough and basin. I kept all of the plumbing fittings in place because when you're doing a budget renovation, you want to try and keep as many of the plumbing fixtures where they are. If you start moving around a lot of the plumbing and electrical, that's when the renovation costs are going to start considerably adding up, because that's where you're going to need to hire trades in to come and do that. So I'm wanting to keep those plumbing fittings where they are, where the basin is. However, the two top fittings for the washing machine, I will get a plumber to move those down below the bench, because I'm wanting to add in a bench space here, which will mean the washing machine and dryer need to sit below the bench, and then there'll be nowhere for the hoses to go, because you can't run those hoses around the front of the bench, as that's going to look really silly and very untidy. Once that was all done, I grabbed out a primer, which you'll see here is what I'm doing in the video, and I'm just painting on the primer to all of the wooden trim. If you've seen any of the previous episodes, you will have seen that I painted the trim in the rest of the house all white to try and modernize the home, and I'm doing the exact same thing here in the laundry to keep the house all uniform, but also because I think it's going to look so much better in this space without having that wooden trim really dating the home. Once the primer was on, I then grabbed my white high gloss paint and started to paint that onto all of the trim and also onto the doors. I'm rolling just one coat of the white paint onto the door front and the door back, because they have already previously been painted and they were a cream. So they're actually taking the paint quite well, and they're not going to need very many coats in order to cover this. Whereas for the wooden trim, because the wood is quite a dark color and it is actually going to take a fair bit to cover, I needed to do the primer, and then I also did 3 coats of white paint over the top of the primer, just to make sure that I had a nice solid coverage of that white and you weren't going to see that wood color seeping through the white paint.
The laundry makeover is underway. What I've done so far is we've removed the old tiles from the wall. We've then taken out any damaged plasterboard and replaced that with a new sheet and filled that in. The old basin has been removed and I've put a new basin in. So once the basin has been installed, we need the plumber to come back and just put in that tapware. It is just sitting there for now. It's not actually plumbed in. We're going to be tiling this whole wall. So once I have got the plumbing done, I'm going to get all of that tiling done on that wall. The flooring is actually going to be the vinyl planks, which are the same throughout the rest of the house. And so the vinyl planks are going to get installed. I have painted some of the inside of this cabinet. So we've just put a clear coat of the wall paint on that cabinet shelving. That's just timber shelving. The door has been painted here, but there's so much more to do in this laundry makeover. So let's dive into it.
Now, when you're renovating, plans and designs regularly change, and you may have just heard me talk about in the previous section of the video that I was going to have the washing machine and dryer side by side. But when I actually started working in this space, it really sort of started to dawn on me that it wasn't going to work very well if I had the washing machine and dryer side by side, because the pieces that I had already purchased and put in this room weren't going to work very well to enable that to happen. I've been completing this entire house makeover on a budget, and so some of the pieces that I've picked up earlier in the piece, I didn't necessarily think about the practicality of them in this space, and the particular laundry trough that I got was actually quite low. I purchased the trough on sale as X4 stock and I thought it was a bargain, so I just grabbed it. But now that it's actually here and installed, if I was to put the bench top straight off the laundry trough, there wouldn't actually be enough height there to fit the washing machine and dryer underneath the bench. Now, because the trough is already installed and the plumbing has been done, I can't build the trough up and make it sit higher. So what I'm going to need to do is rethink my design. Now, you'll see that I've just used my multi-tool with the plunge cut blade to cut out all of the skirting boards, because what I'm now going to be doing is building some custom cabinetry that I'm going to install here, and I am actually going to have the washing machine and dryer stacked on top of each other so that I've then got enough room to install a bench top next to the washing machine and dryer, and the bench top can be the same height as the basin. What you've just seen in the video is where I've taken a special drill bit and I have used that drill bit to countersink some holes at certain intervals along on the first panel of board that I'm going to be installing. The reason why you do this is because then once you screw the board onto the wall, the screws are going to sit below the panel and they're going to look flush, so that I can use some wood filler and fill those holes, and you're not going to be able to see the screws, and it's all going to look like the cabinetry was supposed to be there. On one side of the cabinetry that I'm adding, I have a solid wall, and the solid wall has studs behind it, which meant I could screw the boards straight into the studs. Now on the other side, I don't have anything to screw into, so what I need to do is install a support that I can use to then screw the board into on the other side. I placed heavy duty anchors into the wall and then screwed these boards in place so that the boards were nice and secure, and they were going to be able to be the supports that I used to screw the rest of my panels to those supports. I got the second MDF board and I went along and countersunk all of the holes in this board as well before going back into the laundry and screwing it all together. Once the two side panels were installed, I then needed to cut down 4 more panels that I'm going to be using to create a rectangle box that I'm going to be sitting on top of the 2 side panels for additional storage. I measured and cut them all down to size, so the 2 side panels were going to be a slightly different size to the 2 top and bottom panels, because I needed to measure the distance that I had from the top of the 2 side panels that I had already installed to the roof, but I also wanted to leave a little bit of room at the roof where I was going to be able to put a trim so that I could blend it in nicely with the rest of the room. I went along and drilled all of the holes for the countersunk screws, and then I went along and screwed all of the box together. To make sure the cabinetry was going to be as hard as a rock and all stuck together, I also used a little bit of liquid nails on the inside before I screwed them. Now that all my cabinetry was together and installed, it was time to apply the tile glue adhesive onto the wall, because next up I'm going to be tiling this wall with a beautiful feature tile. You want to make sure you get the tile glue the right consistency, because you don't want it to be too runny that the tile is going to slide down the wall, but you also don't want to mix it up too firm, because then it's going to dry too quickly. Now, this is actually a quick dry tile glue, and I found that I needed to mix up small batches of the glue before applying small batches of the tiles to the wall, because if I mixed up too much glue at once, it would go hard before I had a chance to install all of those tiles. So I would apply the tile glue onto the wall in a section, and then I would back butter each individual tile and then slap that onto the wall. And then once I completed that section, I would mix up some more tile glue, apply the tile glue onto the wall, back butter the tile, and then put that onto the wall as well. I was actually really lucky in this space because there wasn't very many cuts that I needed to do to the tiles, and most of them were actually full tiles that I was installing. You'll see here that all of the middle section was all full tiles, and then I just needed to do a couple of cuts for the end tile up against the cabinetry, but the rest were all going to be full tiles except for some that needed to be cut down on the ends. When you don't have very many cuts, you're able to get the tiling done a lot faster than when you have a whole lot of intricate cuts to do. When I did need to make a cut to the tile, I would measure and mark out on the tile what I needed to cut, and then I would use the diamond blade on my angle grinder to cut it down to size. All of the tools that I used in the makeover are linked down in the video description. So if you're wanting to have a go at doing a project yourself and you're not exactly sure what tools you can use, these are all really great tools for beginners to have a go at. They're very beginner friendly, and they're also reasonably cost effective. I finished laying the last couple of tiles and made sure that I had the spaces all installed correctly throughout, and then it was time to start on my back door. Now, the back door wasn't in the greatest condition. It probably could have been removed and replaced with a new back door, but given the budget and the timeline of my makeover, I thought it was going to be easier to repair the door. If you do have the ability to, you could replace the back door, but in this instance, I just wanted to give it a fix up, patch all of the holes, and then give it a scuff sand and paint the door. So here I am using my orbital sander to give the door a scuff sand, which is really important when you're going to be painting the surface to make sure the paint sticks. I then grabbed out the Agnews multi-purpose filler and I mixed that up. Now, this is a quick drying filler that is going to go really hard so that I can then sand off the excess and fix the bottom of the door. You just need to mix it up until it is a paste-like consistency. So you're going to add a little bit more of the putty and water until you get it to this consistency. And then once you've got the putty consistency correct, you're just going to go in to the door or whatever it is that you need to fix fix and patch up, and you're going to just use that to repair that space. Now, the easiest way to do this is going to be with a spatula, but I actually didn't have one on site this day. So what I did is a little bit of upcycling and multi-purposing, and I just used a piece of cardboard to mix the putty and then install that onto the door. Now you want to apply it fairly thick because you want to make sure that you have filled the entire hole completely, and then you're not going to then sand it off and need to do another patch. Because this is going to be really hard drying, you can sand off the excess. So don't worry about using too much because you can always sand it down afterwards, but you want to make sure that you're using a liberal amount and you're not being too sparse with it. And because this is a multi-purpose putty, I was also able to use this to fill the hole in the plaster wall that there was. I then went along and started to remove all of the spaces from in between the tiles. I used just little white cross spaces for these tiles, and so in all of the individual joins between the tiles there's going to be a white cross spacer, and I just needed to pull those out. I started off just going through and pulling all the easy to remove ones out with my hand before I grabbed a pair of pliers and just pulled out any of the extra ones that were a little bit more deeply in the tiles. Once all the spaces had been removed and I went through and checked that there was no tile glue anywhere that I needed to remove, I would then go through with my grout and start installing the grout onto the tiles. Some people don't like the idea of doing grouting, but for me, I actually really like grouting and I find it really easy to do. You're just going to get a grouting tool and you're going to use that tool to push the grout in between the cracks of all of the tiles. You're simply just going to scoop up the grout and then push it in between the cracks. Once again, using a reasonably liberal amount because you want to make sure that you have plenty of grout in that space and it's not going to be too thin. You're going to make sure that there's excess grout in there, and then once it starts to dry, you're going to wipe away any excess grout. You need to kind of play it by day in terms of how warm the space is and how quickly the grout is going off as to how much you apply the grout before you go back and clean off the excess. For this wall, and because it was quite a cold day when I was applying the grout, I was able to just go through and put the grout in everywhere that I had tiled in one sitting before needing to wipe off any excess. Whenever I do any tiling work, it always surprises me so much by how much better the tiles look after the grout goes in. And I think it's for me, I chose a color that blended really nicely with the tiles and made the tiles look quite uniform, as opposed to a dark color that was going to really make all of those grout lines stand out. If I had have chose a dark color grout, it would have looked a little bit more like it did before the grout went in. But when I chose this light color gray grout that blended really nicely with the tiles, it just had a really nice seamless look after I'd installed the grout. As soon as I finished applying the grout, I came in with a sponge and a bucket of water and just started to wipe off the excess grout on the tiles only. So this isn't the grout line, this is just the excess that is on the tiles. And I started by going through and wiping off each individual tile, but leaving the grout in those grout lines until a little bit later and just giving it a little bit more time to dry and get a little bit more solid. Once I'd wiped off all of the excess from the tiles and I thought the grout was hard enough, I then went in with my wet sponge and I started to wipe off the excess for the actual grout lines. So I would work my way along each individual grout line, wiping off the excess and just making sure I only take out enough so that the grout line is then flush with the tiles and it's not digging in or cutting out too much of the grout so that I'm going to have any gashes or holes. Once I finished the grouting, it was time to paint on the primer. Now, I needed to paint on the primer to the back door because the back door was a timber surface that I was going to be painting for the first time. I showed you a little bit earlier that I did a scuff sand of this door, so I went in with a 120 grit sandpaper and sanded the whole door before cleaning it down with a degreaser, and that's the prep work that you need to do before painting any surface. So once the prep work was done, I was able to grab the primer and use my paintbrush to go along and paint all of the areas that I couldn't reach with the roller, and then just grab out my mini microfiber roller and paint on all of the areas where I could paint over with the roller. Now, my putty that I had added wasn't actually quite dry when I was installing this primer, so I actually just left that, and I'm going to come back in tomorrow to sand that off and put the primer over the top of the putty. All of the cabinetry that I added, I used an MDF composite material to create to try and keep the budget low. So this is not actually a solid timber product, but it is an alternative to a timber such as a pine, but it is a little bit cheaper and a little bit easier to get your hands on than pine. So I've used this to create this cabinetry, but because this does not have any primer on it, if I was to paint straight onto this MDF composite material, it would just absorb all of my paint. And so it was really important that I used the primer and went through and put the primer on all of this wood as well before I started painting it. Now that the primer is all on, I'm going to be building some shelves that I'm going to apply onto the tiled wall. Initially, I thought I was going to put the shelves on the other side of the room, but I actually have decided that I'm going to put these shelves on the tiled wall now and just keep the other side of the wall empty so that I can then have a little bit of open space in this room. So what I've got here is my Bosch workbench. Now it's made of bamboo and it has a really durable base, and I've set that up with some clamps, and I've got some pieces of timber that I'm just cutting down to size using my circular saw, and then I'm using my orbital sander just to sand off the ends to make them nice and smooth. Now, ordinarily, I would have bought the thickness of the boards that I wanted for the shelves, but my hardware store was out of the thickness that I wanted, so I got a larger board, and then I'm just ripping that down to size with my circular saw. There's a guide on the circular saw that you can use to help you rip down to size and make sure you get it even along the whole duration of the board. Here I'm now cutting down the workbench to size. So I got the workbench, and it is actually a timber product, this bench, and I'm then cutting that down to size to install that between the cabinetry and the basin that I've added in. To install the workbench, I needed to drill a couple of holes in the tiles, and you need to use a special drill bit if you are going to be drilling into tiles. I then put some anchors here into the tiles so that I had a nice solid surface, and then put a couple of little L brackets in that I'm going to put the bench on top of. I also installed the L brackets to the side of the basin so that I can sit my bench on top of that and then screw up from underneath into this L bracket to hold the bench in place. This actually was quite an easy process, installing the L brackets and then sitting the bench on top and then screwing the bench into these L brackets. Just make sure that you check that it is level before you screw in those brackets, because you don't want your bench top to be uneven. You want to make sure that that is nice and level. The same applies for the shelves. I just used shelving brackets that I installed here, but because I was drilling into tiles, I actually only drilled one of the holes in the shelving bracket and then used liquid nails as well. The liquid nails is a really strong product, but because I needed to hang it vertical, I wanted to put a screw in there as well just to hold it in place while the liquid nails dried. I then mixed up some wood filler and went along and filled all of the holes in all of the cabinetry, and also in those extra holes of the shelving brackets where I didn't put a screw, but I filled both of the holes because I just want it to look uniform, and I don't want it to look as though there's only one screw and the other hole is empty. But because I've used the liquid nails, I just filled both of the holes, and I'm going to paint these brackets. Once all of the filler was dry, I then was able to go along and sand off the excess on the bottom of the back door, and also sand off the excess on the shelving brackets and on the cabinetry where I added the wood filler. Now that all the sanding was done and I had removed all of the excess, I needed to go along with my primer and just do a little bit of patching. I had to paint over all of the wood filler because, once again, wood filler doesn't go very well when you just paint your top coat of paint straight onto the wood filler. You really want to use a primer on the wood filler before you paint your actual top coat, whatever paint you've chosen to use over the top of that. So I went along and filled in all of the spots where I'd added the wood filler. I also did a little bit here on the side of the door. And then I also needed to put a first coat of primer on the brackets for the shelves. I'm keeping the actual top of the shelves as the natural wood look, and I'm just going to be adding a clear gloss to that. But the actual brackets underneath, because I've put the wood filler in there, I just didn't want to leave them as that natural wood look because I felt like the wood filler was going to look a little bit funny, and so I added a primer onto those as well. Now it's time to get painting, and if you've been following along with this home renovation series, you probably would be able to tell by now that green is the theme. I have painted a lot of green throughout the house. The master bedroom feature wall is green, the whole kitchen is pretty much green, and so in keeping with the green theme, I am painting the laundry green as well. I'm actually using the exact same green color called Garden Rooftop by British Paints, and I'm going to be painting that here on all of the new cabinetry. But then I also decided to use the same green on the whole room and actually do a color drench where I'm painting all of the walls and all of the cabinetry this same green. As usual for me, I didn't use any masking tape and I just cut in against all of the edges. So I would go along with my paintbrush and cut in around all of the edges, almost as if it was like a picture frame. You use the paintbrush and go around all four corners and the edges, and then you get a roller, and in this case I'm just using a mini microfiber roller, and then I'm rolling everything in the middle. If you don't have very much experience painting it, you can definitely use masking tape along the skirting boards and also along the cornice by the roof, just so that you don't get any paint where you don't want it to be. But if you do have experience painting, in my personal opinion, I find it so much easier not to have to install the masking tape, and I actually find that usually I get a really nice clean line by not using the masking tape and cutting in. Whereas when you've got the masking tape, even if you have really good expensive masking tape, sometimes you will still get bleed through. And when you've got this green, if you get bleed through onto that white ceiling, it is going to be really obvious. When I'm painting walls, I follow the exact same technique. I go along and cut in around underneath the top of the cornice and then go around the bottom where the skirting board is, followed by each side of the wall, and then roll the middle of the wall. When you're using the roller, you want to try and make sure that you don't have too many roller lines. So you're going to go up and down the wall, making sure that you go back over with a dry roller in each individual space once you have finished with that particular area. This wall on the other side of the laundry is also going to be green. Now, this would probably be a wall that I could leave in the cream and have that as a different color because it is a reasonably small space and I don't want it to feel too compact with this dark green paint. But in the effort of color drenching, I am just going to paint the whole room green and see how it turns out. I needed to go along and paint a second coat of paint on everything. Thankfully, this paint that I am using has a quick dry feature and it is actually a really quick drying paint. So I was able to paint on the first coat and then give it 2 hours touch dry, 4 hours recoat, and I was able to apply another coat of paint after just 4 hours. So that afternoon I came back in and I applied the second coat of paint onto all of this green cabinetry. Once I finished painting all of the green paint, it was time to paint the back door. So I've now got my gloss paint that I've used for all of the trim in here, and I'm using the same white gloss paint for this back door. I'm just going to use my mini microfiber cloth and my paintbrush and roll a coat of this high gloss white onto the back door. When you are working with a high gloss paint, it is the least forgiving out of all of the paints and the most likely to get roller marks. So when you are applying the paint with the roller, you want to make sure that you apply it reasonably quickly and that you don't go back over the sections that you have already rolled after it starts to dry and get sticky. I then took my paintbrush with my high gloss white paint and cut in for these shelving brackets and painted them with this high gloss white. I needed to be very careful because I didn't want to get paint on my shelves, my wall, or my tiles. So I did have to be very careful when cutting these in. I let everything dry completely and then came back in the next day to do the last final finishing touches. So what I needed to do was apply the caulking to nearly everywhere that I had a gap or an edge. So I went along with my silicone and my caulking gun, and I'm just using the silicone gun to put a bead of silicone and then using my finger with some window cleaner to make sure that is nice and smooth and I get a really nice finish. So I went all along the walls where the cabinetry was, and then I applied a nice big bead of silicone along the edge of the bench on the 3 sides and just finished that off nicely. I use the window cleaner to spray my finger so that the silicone doesn't stick to my finger, as the window cleaner acts almost like a guard to stop that silicone from getting sticky and sticking onto your finger. I also had to silicone up all of the gaps for the tiles, so I went along with a bead of silicone everywhere the tiles ended and up against all of the skirting boards and window frames and any other ends where the tiles did come to a direct stop. I then decided I was going to paint one more coat of the white gloss on the back door. It probably would have been okay, but when you got up close, it did look a little bit patchy, and I wanted just to have that really nice solid white finish. So I'm just going to use my paintbrush and cut in around the edges again and roll one last coat of white paint. Now I needed to do a top coat for the timber. I'm wanting to use a nice durable top coat, and so I do have an oil-based polyurethane that I'm going to paint onto this timber. I'm just using a little paintbrush and painting that onto the timber, making sure not to get it anywhere that I don't want to get this particular gloss, but it is a reasonably glossy finish and it is making the color of the timber really pop. You'll find that when you paint on a top coat to wood, it does bring out the color of the wood a little bit, and if you didn't want that slight yellow coming through this timber, you would need to apply either a timber stain or a whitewash onto the timber first before you apply the top coat. But for me, I actually wanted to have a little bit of warmth coming through because I've got a really dark space, and the timber is going to help create a little bit more atmosphere and add that little bit of warmth to the space. And so I decided to leave the timber raw and just apply the clear gloss. For the last touch, I just came in with some styling elements and added a few home decor pieces, because when you're preparing a space, you want to make it look as good as you can. And by adding a few home decor elements and a little bit of greenery, you're going to give it a really beautiful feel. Now let's take another quick look at where we started in this laundry and then now how the laundry turned out. It's now a stylish and functional space that cost me only $1,000 in materials. The laundry makeover is finally complete, and I hope you like how it turned out. Now, it's probably got a little bit too much green. I probably would have, if I had had enough of the cream paint left, maybe painted this wall cream as well. You'll see that I did paint this over with cream just in the back of this wall here. However, once you've got a washing machine and dryer here, you're not going to see that wall at all. It was just for the purposes of staging the house for sale because we weren't going to be putting a washing machine and dryer in here, but I wanted that wall to be cream, not have that such dark feeling when you look into this space. Overall, I love how the laundry has turned out. The built-in cabinetry is very different to what I initially planned to do in this room.
I'm not sure if you remember at the start of the video when I talked about what I was planning on doing, but this bench, I was planning on having it run the whole way across up to the wall and then having the washing machine and dryer underneath. But when I started to work it out, it just wasn't going to work well in terms of the overall look and feel, and we weren't going to get very much storage at all in this space. So what I ended up doing is creating this built-in cabinetry with the washing machine and dryer to fit in here. And then you've got your room for your laundry basket up the top here, which is going to be out of the way. You've got some space here that you can work with in terms of folding your washing or setting things on that space there. You've also got room underneath here that you can put laundry baskets or anything that you're wanting to put in there. And we've got a small trough that's also got some built-in storage and in those cabinets. The shelving up here, you're probably not going to use that a lot in terms of practicality. I really put it there more so for creating the look, feel, and ambience in the space. You might be able to put your washing machine liquid and those sorts of things up there that you can easily get access to. But there's also a full storage cupboard here at the end where you're going to have a lot of room for towels and linens and those sorts of things. I hope you've enjoyed this laundry makeover. Now make sure you hit subscribe and come back next week where I'm going to have an entire video showing you this makeover from start to finish, breaking down the budget and how much money I've spent on each of these rooms and how much I've spent on the entire transformation.
If you're new to my channel, I've linked the last 4 episodes of this series so that you can go back and check them out.